We're just letting people arrive now. We expect a relatively solid crowd. So the concept of this event is pretty simple. The idea is that we're looking at security. The primary geographic basis is North America. So in essence, this summit is going to explain to people how security thinking is unfolding over there. The primary audience of this event, live, it's Asia. And once we share the recording, it'll be Europe. So what we do with these summits is we rotate around the world with nominal geographies and try to explain aspects of what's happening in those geographies elsewhere. We'll have forthcoming events on intellectual property management and also automation. The details of those will be coming soon. I'll give some at the end. Now, for this particular event, we're going to have a rather stellar lineup of speakers. We've got Brian from the Open Source Security Foundation. We've got Kate coming in here from SPDX. We're going to have a on-the-ground what happened discussion about Log4j from one of the security experts at FOSSA. And then we're going to talk about some of the big picture things the OpenChain project is up to. Now, OpenChain summits like this are not too formal. We try to make sure that everyone feels free to ask questions, to prefer their own knowledge, and basically to feel at home with what we're doing. Raise your hand, unmute yourself and ask a question. Don't hesitate to be part of this discussion. Now, before we get started, I'm going to show our antitrust policy notice. We put this up at the beginning of all of the meetings around Linux Foundation, and it's to help ensure that everyone is aligned with how we run our meetings and why we do so. You can read the full antitrust policy notice on our website. And if you're from a Linux Foundation member company, you can, of course, contact their counsel, Andy Updegrove, or you can simply email me and I will assist you with your questions. Now, we're going to dive straight into the Open Source Security Foundation and Brian's work. For those of you who are new to open source security, you should be aware that for many years, we've been talking about what's necessary around open source security, and we've been working to support it. However, things took a quantum leap forward last year with the founding of the Open Source Security Foundation. And Brian will dig into that to let you know how and why. After we have his big optics, we move to SPDX, Software Bill of Materials, which is about one of the key things of implementation of healthy practices. All right, Brian, I'm going to stop my screen share. I'm going to throw straight over to you and at your own pace.
Great. Well, thank you for this. Thank you for the invitation to speak. I'm very honored to speak with the OpenChain community, who perhaps of all the Linux Foundation projects seems to have done the most to invest in and think seriously about software supply chain issues and actually put into production something to address that. So kudos to all of you. The rest of the Linux Foundation and the rest of the open source community really now has to catch up. And I think there's even some ways to move even further and cover some of the other types of weaknesses that we have in the modern software supply chain, which I'll cover in just a bit. But for those of you who I haven't met before, I'm Brian Bellendorf. I'm General Manager for OpenSSF. I've actually been with the Linux Foundation for 6 years now, almost 6 years. I joined in 2016 to lead a different initiative called Hyperledger and have passed the baton on that to Daniela Barbosa, who's carrying the torch on that very well. I have a background with open source going back to when dinosaurs roamed the web. And I won't go into too much detail since you all can find out more. And I want to talk more about the details that I'm here to talk about. So I'm at the OpenSSF. We really are focused on the software supply chain. and thinking about how open source software is built, how it's collaborated upon, how software makes its way from upstream, from developers who are working in IDEs and the upstream source code management systems, to the build tools that they use. And in that development and building, how do they choose what dependencies to pull in? How do they update those dependencies? How do they really push those out downstream in the right way to the package managers and then on to the consumer? We've seen in the last few years, I don't have to cite headlines, I don't think, for you, aside from Log4j, which is a different beast. But when you talk about SolarWinds and Color.js even, a lot of these are actually attacks on the software supply chain, attacks on our process of building software from beginning to end. And we've sat and within the supply chain integrity working group, they sat and identified 8 different places where where the supply chain is vulnerable, because we kind of built the software industry and the open source software part of this at a time of very high trust, at a time when, does anyone remember, were you on the internet when you received email from an unknown person and you thought that was a cool thing? Because, wow, somebody else knows about email too, and we can talk. And likewise, it used to be that in the early days of open source software, you could generally take for granted the contributions coming in from other sources. You generally trust that somebody showing up, if they showed up with a patch or a pull request, you could vet it, of course, make sure it did the right thing, but you generally presume good intentions. And then when you put up packages for download off, an Apache.org website, there wasn't a whole lot of rigor to make sure that everything was what it was supposed to be. Occasionally, packages would get signed, of course, in major distribution channels. Like Debian package managers, you have some signature verification going on. But at all these different steps, code review, the source code control system, as the code makes its way to the build system, the build platform itself, perhaps the dependency you're pulling in isn't actually what you thought it was, because you had a typo in your inclusion and somebody was typo squatting in NPM on that, for example, to all the way to resulting in a bad package that gets picked up by the endpoint. All of these are sources that are really deserving of attention. So the OpenSSF was pulled together actually initially 2 years ago by the merger of some efforts that had begun, one at GitHub, one at Google, to try to talk about what systematically can we do to improve the security of open source software. And it really got its jetpack strapped to its back last October when we realized, okay, what's going on here deserves some funding. Let's move this forward and let's start to pull together a staff and a budget to be able to accomplish some big things. But really, there's 5 main areas of activity that so far we've conducted, and there could be more that come down the pipe. The first of those are specifications and tools for evaluating and improving the security posture of open source projects. And I'll get into some of this in a bit, but you're probably familiar with the best practices badge, as well as something called Security Scorecards. The basic thing is, how do we help developers make smarter choices about which pre-existing open source software to use? And then how do we help end users understand the risk that they may have in their mix of different open source software that they're using? The second is to really look at improvements in the software supply chain itself, as I just mentioned, those different points of intervention that we might be able to harden with things like SPDX and SBOMs, of course, but also with more signatures on packages, or being able to portably describe different levels of attestation of confidence in the way that the software is being built. We're also developing a list, and this will probably evolve into a series of lists of the most critical open source projects in order to prioritize all of our efforts. Understanding how do we avoid a scenario where it's just like that XKCD comic with that one little package that is maintained in somebody's spare time, so to speak, that everything else depends upon, and if that fails, everything falls over. How do we avoid that? How do we try to find those widely used but kind of unsung packages that could be the source of problems, and make sure they're well taken care of? Make sure that there's more attention paid to them, perhaps even some process brought to how they're built, default to be able to improve their security posture. And this is just not just the most popular ones. This is not just the most interesting ones. These are the ones most critical. And an example of this would be Log4j. We also think it's important that there be a real human element to what we're doing here. Obviously, open source software is made of people. It's made of developers and other types of folks who contribute to the health of a project. But especially in security, there is no silver bullet. There's no tool by itself or anything else that will solve this. What we really need are the cybersecurity experts out there, the developers who really understand secure software development, as well as people who are still climbing that learning curve, to come together and think about how do they direct their own talents and direct funding that we can find elsewhere towards helping critical projects in need. That's a real key thing. And then we also think there's a whole lot of education that needs to happen amongst in the open source community, frankly, the whole of the software industry, about basic practices for writing secure software. There's a whole lot of techniques. There's a whole lot of baseline understanding that, frankly, is just not a part of most computer science curricula, nor are they usually things that developers who are self-taught or learn in a coding academy or the likewise really understand. And I can even give an example from Log4j, where there was a practice that they used that led to the bug that they really should not have used. So these are some of the ways that we've been active today. There's more coming down the pipe. But I also want to emphasize that this is still an open source project. It is a different kind of open source project because we create some tools here and there. There's some software that's the result of the work that's going on, and I'll give some examples in a bit. But everything we do is transparent. Everything we do is done through public working groups that are accessible by mailing lists, by Slack channels, by Zoom calls. The credibility of what we do really hinges upon the things that we work on publicly. There are a couple of things that we are going to start to do that are a little bit more security sensitive and are different in the way that Let's Encrypt as a service to the public open source community as an issuer of TLS certificates, because there's an operational component there is not as public. But everything that we do at the OpenSSF is guided by this core set of values, which for anybody who has been active in open source projects should look very familiar to what they do, to perhaps values that there are other open source projects take. And a really important one here that I want to emphasize is maintainers first. A lot of the dialogue about insecure open source code out there has been about the developers, and the maintainers on these projects. Either they're not very good, or they are, pissed off because they're not getting paid, or they're under resourced, and we just need to throw them some donations. None of that really, all of that feels very, very much about speaking down to maintainers and developers, whereas we think you have to elevate them, you have to resource them, you have to make them more capable when it comes to delivering software that can be just as dynamic and fun and collaborative and everything it can be as the current way that open source is built, but that also can recognize its role as critical infrastructure in modern society. So these are where our core values are, and that's a really key one, making sure that maintainers are emphasized in everything that we do. So in the first year of existence, there were quite a few things that this community, even though entirely comprised of volunteers, was able to deliver. First off, and this is a really big one, thanks to one of my colleagues, David Wheeler, here at the Linux Foundation. He developed most of this. There's a set of courses available on edX called the Secure Software Development Fundamentals courses. This is courseware that ranges from 10 hours for one of the three modules to, I'd say, about 50 hours total. There's an exam that you can take and a certification that you can pay for, but that's optional. The content is all free. We think this is content that should be standardized. It should be the kind of thing that companies start to require their employees to take before they engage on open source projects. Frankly, they should take them anyways for internal development. These are the kinds of things that just the fundamentals everyone should be familiar with. We've actually had, I should have edited this, over 6,000 people register for this. We'd like to get that up by at least another order of magnitude, if not more, this year. Another major effort delivered something called the Security Scorecard, which is a set of automation of some scripts that evaluate a repository for a set of practices that we feel actually reflect well on, that show a degree of due diligence when it comes to security. An example of that is, do you have automated tests? Okay, that's a real basic one. Do you have automated tests that test for the absence of things, not just for the presence of things? That's an important thing. And do you have automated tests that try to fuzz, that throw, kind of lots of different input at the inputs in your program, right? Another one is, do your build scripts, do your make files pin dependencies? That is, are they, do you lock in which version of which underlying dependencies you're pulling in, or are you just pulling in the latest of whatever is available on NPM or PyPy or that kind of thing? If you pin it, that's a good idea, because sometimes you end up with situations where the most recent one pulled in can have an issue. Of course, we do still want to encourage people to upgrade quickly, right? So anyways, the scorecards work is very interesting. We also drafted a guide to coordinated vulnerability disclosure for open source projects. We feel one of the weaknesses, and this is certainly something that came up during Log4j, although they didn't have a lot of options there. One of the weaknesses typically in open source is how those communities engage with major users, major downstream organizations. And often there's not enough time to get some of the major downstreams upgraded before the vulnerability becomes public, before people start asking questions, that sort of thing. And you want to not be also coming up with your second or third or fourth iteration of your patch in public, while people are scrambling to update. So we put together a guide to coordinated vulnerability disclosure to try to be helpful to open source projects to understand how to do this in a way that's perhaps most fair and least likely to lead to unfortunate types of feedback that we see sometimes. We also have continued to transition and grow the open source OpenSSF best practices badge. This is just like the scorecard, something to help understand and evaluate the risk and the security posture of an open source project. This is something that should take no more than a half hour for any open source project themselves to fill out. Somebody is drawing on my screen here. I'm going to stop sharing just for a little bit until that stops. Is that, I'm going to hope that stops.
I got to check, that might be a troll. I'm going to see if I can boot a person who may be the cause. So
I saw a name that said Vicky in it.
Yeah,
so
they're gone.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. So the best practices badge is the kind of thing that we think every open source project should strive for. We're starting to require that here at the Linux Foundation of our projects, and make sure that can become something that folks depend upon. It really asks for really the basics. Do you have a security team? Do you have a published process for how you ingest those security claims, concerns about security, that kind of thing. So that's also a big part of what we're doing. Coming out as well of the supply chain integrity working group is a specification
Brian,
that is
so sorry to interject. Just your screen isn't currently sharing, just so you know.
Oh, it's not. I'm going to have to rejoin you all. I'll be right back.
So sorry, Brian.
All right, let's try this again. All right. SALSA is a specification for describing levels of attestation of software supply chain integrity. Please check that out. It's on its way to, I think it's still a very early specification. We haven't formally driven it through a specification process, but there's already software being built to demonstrate this is how you build essentially a secure software factory out of this standard. We also have coordinated with Harvard to develop something called the Harvard Open Source Software Census. And this is a survey of both open source developers, but also of the data that's available out there to try to determine the most critical open source projects. In fact, a new version of this is just about to be released. And finally, we've grown the organization to 61 different companies that and other organizations that are supporters of what we're doing. In the interest of time, because I do want to keep it open for conversation, we're pretty good, about 10 minutes. We organize our efforts through major working groups, through different working groups. We have 6 different working groups underway, focused on best practices, focused on another on vulnerability disclosures, a third on identifying security threats. And this is where we're really developing metrics for open source projects. Another called securing critical projects, trying to identify those and then think about how do we direct some resources to them. One further on security tooling, which is about what are really the best available security tools and for scanning, for benchmarking the state of security inside of an open source project. And then finally, supply chain integrity, ensuring the provenance of open source code. And this is where, as I mentioned, Salsa came from and quite a few others. It's a little bit of a circus. There's a lot of different things coming at different angles to the software supply chain question and how do we really raise the floor on open source projects. There's a couple of new things that we've started to kick off, though, that are also worth highlighting in particular. One is something called Project SigStore. Project SigStore is a different approach to signing packages by developers, particularly the further upstream you go, the better. It's sort of a Let's Encrypt-like toolkit for provisioning and verifying package signing keys to those developers. These are intended to be short-lived keys, not intended to be GPG-style keys, but using what's called a transparency log, which is almost like a blockchain. It's something that Google has used in their certificate transparency project as well. But this is a way to try to provide a simple approach to greater degrees of confidence that the package that's sitting here in front of me is the package that the developers signed off on and actually cut. And it's seeing some tremendous traction in the cloud native community. And it has its own website and its own Twitter feed and that kind of thing. It's really starting to take off. We also just announced a new initiative, still pretty young. We're still getting our feet kind of solid on it, on something called Alpha Omega. And this is kind of two halves in one. The alpha side of this is we will have a staff of people who will go out there and work, paid staff, go out and work with open source projects to assist them with security critical improvements. And those can be improvements to their processes, improvements to the policies that they follow, improvements to specific weaknesses in code that they're worried about. Maybe it's even, here's an open CVE that somebody needs to close. And here, this will be a mix of expertise and some funding available to go and cover some of the gaps that are out there. And it's really just about trying to say there's a set of important ones. We just want to make sure, a lot of the major projects are at different places when it comes to how seriously they take security, and so we're going to go out and try to address a good number of those. And then Omega is intended to refer to another end of the spectrum. Really, Alpha is focused on, say, the top 100 most critical projects. There's a larger set of maybe 10,000 that are in semi-active use out there, and through that, we hope to use automation and scanning and tooling to help us identify and fix new vulnerabilities across a wide range of open source projects. Basically, when something new not so much new, but when something like Log4j hits, and we realize, wow, there might be other examples of packages out there in Java or even other languages that take untrusted input and parse it for format strings. Is there a way systematically that we could go and look for that in other open source packages? Now, this is sensitive work. This is the kind of thing that's harder to do publicly, but this is where we'll be resourcing a team to go find them and then work with the maintainers to get them fixed, possibly also providing funds to help remediate the things that are found. And then finally, a third thing that we've just kicked off, this is really a more straightforward kind of and direct kind of project. The GNU toolchain community has needed a better infrastructure for its own continuous integration platform and build services for quite a while. And they were eager to work with the Linux Foundation on getting on board the same kind of infrastructure that the Linux kernel community uses to do its CI and releases. And so they worked with the Linux Foundation's IT staff to figure out a mode that'll work for that. They came up with a budget for it. And we've gone to our membership and said, we'd like to fund this. We'd like, we can cut existing funds to it, but we'd also like perhaps some additional funds to be able to start to help them consider adoption of some of the secure supply chain standards and tooling that we've been talking about here. So it starts starts with making sure the basics are covered and we're not taking it over, we're not telling them what to build. But as they come in and start using the infrastructure, our hope is that we can also start to seed some of the thinking about better security into that project in some interesting way. And I bet there'll be a few more initiatives that we launch before the end of the year. And again, this is pretty crazy, right? All these different initiatives going on, lots I didn't even get to talking about, but they all kind of spread across the supply chain in interesting places. Some of them, of course, very broad, things like education, we hope will help every part of this map. Things like identifying critical projects to prioritize funding, we think will help everywhere as well. But we really need to take a holistic approach here. And we're really eager to find additional things to help flesh out this map. And of course, if anyone has interesting ideas on graphic design and to help make this kind of circus a little more clear, we're happy to take that kind of help as well. And I did want to emphasize our work here, some of it is novel, but a lot of it builds upon years of investment by perhaps it's even fair to say decades of investment by the Linux Foundation in security across a whole number of projects, not least of which is SPDX. Huge credit to Kate, who you'll hear from in a bit, for the work she has led for quite a while on taking this crazy idea around software bill of materials to a standard all the way to ISO and to tooling that really helps drive adoption. And this is something we see investing in quite a bit more. Of course, we're also peers with the Let's Encrypt community, and we think there's actually some interesting work that can be funded further on improvements to DNS and the TLS infrastructure that the Let's Encrypt community is leading some research into, including potentially rewriting some of the core daemons and utilities in that domain into memory-safe languages like Rust. So lots of stuff potentially happening there. But again, just this slide is intended to emphasize we view ourselves as being in a very rich tapestry of other open source projects. Oh, I should also mention the Cloud Native Compute Foundation's security tag, and so many of the technologies we're talking about here grew out of CNCF, and a big debt of gratitude is owed to them. So I would love to invite all of you to get involved. We are an open book. We have an open Slack. We have a GitHub, of course, where I'd say the GitHub is perhaps the central place where so much is managed and documented and things are discussed as issues. That's really a vibrant home. We have a Twitter feed, of course, and other social that can feed off that. But we also do have a town hall happening next week. I'll try to drop the link for this into chat when I'm done speaking. You're more than welcome to attend. And the kind of overarching call around technology is our once every 2 weeks technical advisory call happening every other Tuesday at 11 a.m. Eastern. So I would welcome you all to attend. I recognize that that timing is not a time that is exactly easy for Asia Pacific. We have started to grow our Asia Pacific community. We now have members from the region, including from China. And we are starting to look at what are some ways that we can help engage the community in the Asia Pacific region. Of course, we'd love to engage you directly in the working groups, and things like email and Slack can really work no matter the time zone. But we understand the Zoom calls can be a challenge, and other community building work that we do can be a challenge if it's based on a time. So we will be looking at moving many of those to more Asia Pacific friendly times and potentially opening Asia Pacific time zone friendly versions of many of those calls. So I would love to talk with any of you about how that might happen. And with that, I'm happy to take some questions.
Brian, thank you very much. I'll kick off the questions with first of all, a note that you've had such a long career in this space. It makes you perhaps one of a handful of domain experts who can speak to the last 20 years of evolution here. So for those of you who don't know Brian on the call, what you're hearing is something very important to take to mind. Now, it's really good to hear that you're going to be building out support in Asia Pacific. In fact, just this week, I started chatting with the OpenSSF representatives in China. They're a part of the OpenChain WeChat now. We have about 125 people hanging out and trying to share information. Now, I do have a specific question. I'm coming to it. So the question I have, Brian, is you seem to have consolidated a lot of really good ideas, like the best practices badge, like SigStore. And this seems to be creating a unified narrative. To what extent can we expect more consolidation of projects? And to what extent, do you feel we've done consolidation now? We're going to build out our committees. We're going to build out from that base.
Well, the Linux Foundation as a whole, right, is constantly asking this question about, what's the right level of granularity for our communities. In fact, famously in the networking side of the Linux Foundation, there's been a wave of consolidation, mainly in service of the members of the organization, but also, as you kind of almost every technology domain has this Cambrian explosion and then kind of consolidation phase, right? I think on our side, we're still very much in the Cambrian explosion kind of side. I certainly, what happens is you have this explosion, but then Darwin starts to take over a little bit, and you find certain standards emerge that have simply more traction. Certain tools emerge that have better traction. We think, and a lot of the Linux Foundation core value has been around, let's be a big tent. Look at projects like the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, and they say, we aren't kingmakers. Let's have lots of projects here. Of course, Kubernetes is kind of the the main one, right? And we think likewise, there's plenty of time and room for kind of natural evolution to play out. But I actually think we, the OpenSSF, have an important task to do, which is to some degree, some of these things do not benefit from too many options. And one of those, for example, is software bill of materials. I think there are a couple different SBOM formats out there, but really the world is going to be best served if we find ways to converge on those. We're not in any position to kind of dictate what happens to any of those standards, but if we can apply our resources and time to think about how do we help either bridge between them or make it possible to generate different formats, or perhaps even help encourage folks to consolidate and converge, we'll do that. Same thing with things like package signing approaches, or things like Salsa, right? We're not a standards body. We're not trying to say there's one true way. But I think here a little bit of having a bit more of an opinion about the right way to build things is going to be important for us to actually deliver value to the public.
Now, my ears certainly pricked up when you talked about Salsa, because of course OpenChain is standards, very high level. And we've been doing some stuff in the security domain as well. We'll talk about that towards the end of this event. But as usual, we're way up there on the high level process management. So Salsa sounds like a very interesting initiative for our community to get engaged with. We've had a lot of people talking security. We've had a lot of people using OpenChain to begin to get security processes in play. And we describe our role as helping to onboard people into the domain expertise. So we're very keen to do that. Everyone, if you've got a question for Brian, you can simply unmute yourself and begin to ask it. Until then, I just wanted to have one follow-up question, which is whether we can essentially collaborate further in China. Is there going to be any OpenSSF event happening? Would you like to do a dual event? How can we help promote what you're doing in China? How can we link our narratives together?
Well, on the call are at least two of my colleagues who are based in the region. One is Julian Gordon, who's based in Hong Kong, and Donald Liu, who, Julian, is he Hong Kong or in China? I forget.
So Donald, who's based in Hong Kong. There is also Yang Hing, who's based in Hong Kong.
Yang's here. Okay,
and we've also got Wayne Merrick, I think, on the call, right? So we have a good contingent here.
We have five. Holly here too.
Hallie's here as well. There, I didn't see Hallie. Sorry.
Well, the Linux Foundation is very lucky to have great representation through a group called LFAPAC, who those five are from, who have helped us have a real footprint there. I worked with them extensively on Hyperledger, and it's not just a biz dev kind of role. It's actually go and help build the communities and region. So, Shane, I'd love to figure out what you're doing in China, how to work together on this. Certainly, face-to-face events are a little challenging right now, still, but we're starting to poke at the edges of that. But doing virtual events in time, not only times that are friendly, but also in native language with native language presentations and the like are things that we want to do. So and building up a bit of a meetup culture in the region would be great as well. So let's look for things we can do.
exactly, Shan. Good to see you and work with you again. It's been a long time. I think at least 4 years.
That's right, Hallie. It's been a
Yeah,
while.
it's been a while. So I saw that Keith had connected you with our team here. So let's connect and then work out the cadence of working together, because the team has planned a number of activities in the region as well. Not only in China, but Julian had also organized some other activities for the APAC region. Okay, Shan?
Yep, got it. Yeah, we've had some pretty cool stuff going on. For instance, we're collaborating closely with CAICT, CESI, two organizations under the Ministry of Trade. We're also working with the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And of course, we've got super cool companies like Oppo, Honor, and Huawei on our board. On our call, there's a ton of people here from our Chinese contingent, but also a ton of people here from Japan. We've got some old familiars like Osaki-san, Kato-san, and so on from the OpenChain Japan community. We've also got some newbies, like a personal friend of mine, Keiko Yano from Rakuten. Hey, Keiko. And a bunch of people we haven't seen before. Now, Brian, before I end here, I'm going to ask one more question. But before I do that, I'm going to give a note. Security is always a process, and you're always looking at trade-offs and what you're going to do. So for instance, let's talk about our trawls. In the OpenChain community, we have to try to be as open as possible. And we've got this balance between, do we allow people who look real to enter the rooms and see if they want to be part of this event? And approximately 10% of our audience is new here. Or do we put a higher gateway in? And those type of choices, those type of decisions figure in every part of what you're doing across everything in an organization. Brian, you've been engaging with the US government around the executive order, the White House meeting. Do you have any hints and tips about the mindset in the US of how those hard decisions are made? Are we looking at people trying to lock things down as much as possible, or simply have quick ways to fix things when they go wrong?
I've been looking at the interface between government and the open source community for like 20 years. Actually, I remember in the early days of Apache, even 1995, when government users were not only using the Apache web server, but we had folks from the intelligence community start to ask about, we see you using, secure sockets between these things. Let's have a conversation. In fact, I worked at the White House in 2009 on open technologies, not specifically on open source, but on kind of getting government more comfortable with open source software and with open thinking, open systems, open principles. It's always been a challenging sell, partly because, as we saw on this call, sometimes you have people who are determined to cause problems. Again, we kind of come from an open source world that was high trust and reasonably self-selected, and you could presume people operated in good faith, and that's not really true in government, at least in DC, and I'm sure other countries are facing this as well. But inside of government, people are actually much smarter about open source than you might think. In fact, even in the US, there was the Department of Defense issued this memo in 2003, I think it was, that famously said open source is just as good as off-the-shelf commercial software, so long as you have somebody to provide support for it, or you decide to support yourself. And so usage of open source inside government is very large. And most recently, this conversation we had at the White House a month ago with the National Security Council about the use of open source code and Log4j, and is there a systemic problem here? Is the business model a problem? That sort of thing. We really found that once you talk to the individuals there, they're very thoughtful about this. They realize that open source code comes from this kind of magic combination of the best of intents of just enough people to make it work. And you can't slap a certification process on it, or add a lot of requirements, or add legal liability to the participants in the development of that code. Instead, you have to ask about, how do we help infuse that process with better security practices, better thinking, but that shows up as resources, not as requirements, right? As carrots rather than as sticks. So I'm incredibly optimistic, and I've heard this in some other conversations with other governments. So we certainly have engaged and plan to engage with more to help them understand what we're doing. And I think we will see more resources applied by government on these topics because they recognize this is critical infrastructure. This is like highways and bridges and railroads and other pieces that modern society now requires and functions on. So we're very eager to talk to anybody out there in government who wants to better understand this, and maybe we can look for ways to work together.
Awesome, Brian, thank you. We had one question come in from the chat. It's from Ninjoji-san over at Toshiba. What are the prospects for the application of blockchain and OpenSSF for the time being? Will it be based on certificates for widespread deployment? Well, gosh, you asked the right person here.
And in fact, Julian and worked with me and Wayne and Hallie and others on Hyperledger as well. And Hyperledger, for those who don't know, is a blockchain technology, a series of blockchain technology platforms that actually are not cryptocurrency related. And one important thing to think about in answering this question is there's the world of crypto and tokens and financial instruments and that kind of thing, which I don't know that there's a big role for that to play, although they certainly have cybersecurity challenges, don't they? Seeing all the funds that are getting stolen through bad smart contracts. And so maybe they're going to start to care a little bit more about security and secure approaches to open source development. That's an angle perhaps. But the real question is, do we see usage of blockchain technology? And if we do, it'll come from the more traditional enterprise blockchain distributed ledger types of applications. Right now, there isn't anything in OpenSSF really advancing this. Project SigStore comes closest in that it's a really simple, lightweight way of issuing identities that depends upon something called a transparency log. It isn't decentralized, it isn't distributed, it isn't obviously tokens based, but there is, I think the next step beyond that is in the direction of something called self-sovereign ID or user-centric ID, which there's quite a bit of activity at Hyperledger around. This is a more portable way of doing distributed digital identity than has ever happened before. I have some long-term interest. I think I have an interest in where this goes, and I think this will become a thing, over the next year. But right now, it's not really on the horizon. But I see more of it coming.
Good news and bad news, Brian. More questions incoming.
I'm happy to also answer them in chat. So
no, it's cool.
Especially since I think she might cover things like this. I'll quickly answer Goboto-san's, is it Norio-san's question. Is there any discussion about using SBOM, such as SPDX, and the tools OpenSSF is working on? We love SPDX. We obviously SBOMs are important. The projects so far haven't directly borne on SBOM work, but I think that will change pretty quickly. And when it does, I think we will start to see the support be focused on SPDX. It seems to me that there's some work that we could do that we could be helpful with in helping better resource the tooling around SPDX to make it easier to generate. I think it's once the tools are good enough, I think it's even worth investing in pull requests on major projects to add SBOM generation support, SPDX generation to those major upstream projects. That isn't yet the work of OpenSSF, so I don't want to get too far ahead of my community.
The last question we seem to have is, what are your thoughts on legislative solutions to security malpractice, like bad passwords?
I'm not like libertarian with the capital L or anything like that. I like government. I think government functions well. I think this isn't quite the right place for government to be. And I think it's really important to understand one of the things that has made open source software really successful has been that developers can publish work out there without worrying about if they made a mistake, they might lose their house, right? Or they might lose their job. And that is a delicate balancing act, right? But I think we just have to be focused on carrots rather than sticks, on more resources, more thinking, more kind of standards and specifications, and working with maintainers and keeping, the kind of punitive things to a minimum.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. And at that point, we say you are free to lurk. And it's been fantastic to have you here. And for those of you who are interested in continuing to think about stuff like supply chain management with blockchain, just be aware that OpenChain did this in collaboration with Hyperledger about 5 years ago with something called SParts. And we're about to swing right back at it on a much bigger scale with a proof of concept. More on that in a little while.
Okay. Okay.
And
Excellent.
that's going to be fun. And another thing is probably just that, you know, we're equally invested in things like SPDX. We want to see these new ISO standards really gain traction, and they are. In places like Japan, we've had huge amounts of discussion. We see increased interest in areas like China. And that's why we have Kate here today to talk about SPDX. It became an ISO standard last year, but it's been around for now 11 years, I think.
Yeah.
It is deep in the supply chain, and it's going deeper. You should really focus on this to understand how we solve the supply chain bill of materials in a manual and automation-friendly way. Kate, over to you.
Thanks, Shane, and thanks to my friends here at OpenChain. It's good to see a few familiar names. And some of my other colleagues from SPDX are on too, so hopefully they can help answer things in the chat while I'm talking, because this is I go into slideshow mode, I won't see the chat. So if people want to ask questions, please do unmute and ask questions, and let's go from there. So, and are we up? I think we are. Okay.
Yep, it looks good.
For those who don't know me, my name is Kate Stewart, and I've been now at the Linux Foundation for over 6 years as well, and have been involved working with SPDX as, from a community perspective pretty much since the start in 2009, 2010. And it's been a really great journey with a lot of good community collaboration to get us to where we are. And so when Shane reached out and said, would you want to tell us what's happening in the open landscape? I went, sure, let's do it. So obviously, given this is a security summit, I'll put the security focus onto things, but organizations are always being challenged, you know, am I affected by a vulnerability? We see this happening pretty much, seems to happen around Christmas time. I think they don't want to let people have Christmas. But last year in December, we had Log4j. The year before, you know, we've had the other ones, the meltdowns and so forth. So all these vulnerabilities are out there. They're happening all the time. There's supply chain issues. You need to know if your software is there. Most of our software today is open source. I think this is not a surprise to anyone. What was sort of a surprise to me when we started seeing these reports come out last year is just how pervasive it is. Up to this point, we've been seeing, you know, slightly lower percentages. It's still in the 90s, but it's pretty much 98% right now. So, and most of the studies we're doing are showing the same sorts of numbers. So I'm seeing different reports coming out from different people who are doing scanning, and we're seeing the same sorts of numbers. So open source is pretty much everywhere. And one of the things that was a bit alarming in last year's report from the Suntype folks was the supply chain attacks are growing pretty dramatically. So we need to start looking at understanding how this can be addressed. And this is where, you know, what Brian said. Because for the cost, you know, it's not too much for a developer to fix, but then to deploy it and get it deployed all the way through the ecosystem. SolarWinds, obviously, you know, had significantly high costs that were widely talked about in the press. And then, you know, even the Federal Trade Commission weighed in. And, you know, there's like $700 million from Expedient to settle if there's a thing for privacy. And so we're seeing these things happen very dramatically, and they cost a lot. And that's what's getting companies very interested in understanding their software in detail. So the Linux Foundation did a survey in the second half of last year, and it was done, you know, reaching out to the Linux community, well, the Linux Foundation's community, as well as reaching out to a sample set of panel that was done. And the results were pretty similar between the two, actually. So it did give us a pretty good check on things. And, you know, 98% of the ones we surveyed were said they were using open source, which sort of matches what we were seeing from some of the other studies. And over 95% are concerned about security software. I'm sort of wondering about those 5% that aren't, but I think they probably should be, but that's what we got back. And then, you know, of the organizations surveyed, you know, 47% are using SBOMs today. That there was a lot of like, how pervasive is it? We were hearing a lot of FUD in some of the NTA work, but what we were seeing was a lot of them are already using it today in some form. And based on all the things that happened last year, and some of the executive orders and some of the regulatory work that's sort of starting to be expected that there will be an SBOM, I think 78% are going to be using them this year. And it's even going to go higher next year. So I think we're on the cusp of an inflection to really get this SBOM adoption happening. Now, software bill of materials, what the definition of this is tends to vary a little bit with who you talk to, and people want to put their own spin on it. I'm trying to keep lined up with the definition from the NTA worked on as a multi-stakeholder group over the last 3 years, where it's basically just a formal record containing the details and supply chain relationships of the components being used to build software. And those components could be libraries or modules. They can be open source or proprietary, free or paid. Data can be, widely restricted or access limited. Components can be defined as anything from like individual files to packages to containers. We've got a lot of different ways they're looking at components. So this gives us a fair amount of tooling to just be able to model the basics. So in order for us to really get the supply chain improved, transparency is going to be key. That's what the survey was pretty much talking to us about. People were most focused on getting vulnerability systems and understanding the vulnerabilities. And then, their next action was basically looking at using SBOMs better. So this is some of this data we got in from that survey. Now, for those who are not familiar, a software supply chain is an interesting concept because it's bringing together software from a variety of sets of suppliers and development processes and distribution processes used to create those final software products. And, a defect here could ripple up here, but similarly, that defect on the package I could be in a whole bunch of other products. So we've got this two-way tension of where the defects are, what the impact is going to be. Oops. And one of the things that we sort of were looking at actually is, well, where do you find this vulnerability in a complex set of all the dependencies? And so this is actually a full dependency graph for one of the SPX tools. And we used the deps.dev tooling to map it out. And it's also important to realize that not all these dependencies are the same. There's going to be different dependency types out there. And these things get shown up and brought in different ways. Some things are statically linked. Some things are dependencies for testing that aren't going into production. But being able to understand what is there and how it's used, and be able to sort of figure out for the image you're using, what are you deploying? These are the things that are going to be key for trying to get it to the stage where we can get it automated. And that log4j example that others will be talking about later from the same deps.dev site, there was over 36,000 packages affected by it from the scanning that they did. And, only a fraction had the fixes when I took this screen snapshot. You can go look up the update. But this is the type of scale we're having to work at right now, and this is why we really need the automation, if not yesterday almost, at this point. So producing and consuming SBOMs has got to happen, and the folks here at OpenChain know that right from the start, in the sense that chain specification is calling and expecting there to be a bill of materials for what is being shipped out of an organization, and ideally tracked for everything that's coming in too, so you can do it on the other side. And when you're producing SBOMs, the survey that we did pretty much said that the number one benefit is that developers do better understand their dependencies if they're having to generate these SBOMs for what they're pulling in. And for when you're consuming someone else's SBOM, well, obviously the number one benefit is going to be, you've got support for the compliance and reporting, and you understand what you can do risk analysis much better and more effectively. So the term SBOM, though, has varied. You can have a software bill of materials about the sources, and that's sort of typical what you'd see in an open source project. You could have, though, a software bill of materials about a built image. And that built image has a bunch of libraries linked together and dependencies from that perspective. That's also an SBOM. Or someone could just give you a binary and you may have to try to figure out what it might have inside it. And you don't have build information in intermediate results. All of these are out there today in the ecosystem. And when you're doing your development workflow, you may need to generate or consume any of them. So being able to handle that flexibility is going to be necessary for us to start to get to scale. And realistically, any point in time in the software lifecycle, there's a use for an SBOM. Be it while you're building something, fine, or when you're testing it, you may want to add any certifications on. You may want to augment this information with any knowledge you have along the way because it helps you do risk analysis. And that be it license, be it vulnerability, be it regulatory. All of these are types of analysis we may want to do, and all of them are pretty much looking to have a software bill of materials. So keeping in mind that not one size fits all, making sure we can be flexible is going to be a key for the automation, I think. Now, this is taken out of that survey. The full report, the link is at the bottom there to the full report. It's a rather large report, but what are people prioritizing in the software that they're bringing in? Security is #1 priority across the board. License compliance, #2. And the regulatory compliance and audit seems to have come in as #3 if you just sort of look at the scale. It's here on the side. But you're sort of definitely security is overwhelmingly the #1 or #2. And then the other applications are there. So what does software bill of materials look like today? They've come in different forms. There's a whole bunch of people saying that they generate a software bill of materials or risk bill of materials or insert your favorite acronym of the day. Some of them were spreadsheets, and having some data is better than none. On the other hand, if we really want to go to scale, we're going to need to have the standardization and automation. So, again, from the survey, what do you think the key activities are? Well, first thing is getting a vulnerability reporting system and a flow for dealing with the vulnerabilities. And then the next one that came in was the SBOMs. Now, this chart is kind of interesting in the sense that it segmented the responses into people that were innovators, early adopters, and procrastinators. And it's kind of interesting that the innovators are way up on knowing that they're going to need SBOMs. And they are putting the tooling in place for everything to get ready for this summer, I think. So a lot of data is in that survey, and I'd encourage you to have a read for it if you find this interesting. Now, last May, we had an executive order come out here in the US from the Biden administration that was calling for us to be able to produce SBOMs. So literally it had SBOMs in there. And the NTIA was tasked with defining what the minimum elements were going to be. This is not that it must have at least these elements to be considered an SBOM. Ideally, there's more things in there than is those minimum elements. But there was a lot of guidance that came out, and we've been looking and studying this guidance and trying to figure out how we can align. And obviously, SPDX is in there as one of the automation formats that are supported. There are 3 that are mentioned. There's SPDX, Cyclone, and SWID. And so, obviously SPDX is there. And we've been working with this community. And so when we took everything to ISO, we were pretty sure we had all the pieces that were necessary to match what they were going to be looking for. And so last year when SPDX got its ISO standards, it can satisfy the minimum and much, much more. So if we're going to do things and share software efficiently, we're going to need to have formats we can share, and we're going to need to have processes we all understand, and we all know how to handle things the same way. And realistically, internationalization is key because our software supply chain is not restricted to any one company. It has to be global, and so this is why we spent the effort to go after the ISO standardization for SPDX and for OpenChain for that matter too, so that we could actually have this type of information available. So when we became a standard last year, one one of the things we were focused on is making sure it was staying as freely available. And it is freely available from the ITTF site. And quite frankly, you can also track any updates as we're applying them into the specification. It's been up on GitHub and public, and we'll be keeping it that way. And if you want to participate on anything that you don't like and seeing there, there's more stuff on our website on how to join in. Because if we really want to get to the software transparency to be efficient, we have to standardize the handling of the software information. And then we're trying to also align with the other initiatives because we can't do everything. The OASIS CSAF group has been working on trying to define a format for vulnerability information, for exploitability of vulnerabilities. Because sometimes you want to say that, yeah, we checked, and no, this code is not subject to this vulnerability. You don't want to just have to be able to report vulnerabilities. And obviously, you can see we've been, lining up with watching what's going on with the NTIA. We're going to be, as CISA spins up its new groups, we'll probably be monitoring that. And obviously, the OpenSSF is, the open source vulnerability work that's going on there, and the database there. So making sure that we can have SPDX and working with these other initiatives so that we can put all these pieces together and have an effective flow is the challenge right now. So a little bit of background for those who are not familiar with SPDX is, it was born out of the need to exchange that component information. Dependencies mattered in licensing, and so we were tracking licensing and components pretty much from the start. It's now been over 10 years since the project started, and we have a group of nice people who have let us use their logos to say they're supporting the SPDX and working with SPDX. And for those, I'll say some information at the end for those, if you're working with SPDX and you want to be visible that you're using it, you can sign up pretty easily. Now, a software package data exchange document, or SPDX doc, has to have some degree of creation information, like when was it created and who created it. And then you can have package information, which is effectively a grouping of informations, file level information. And sometimes you have to refer to things at snippet level, which is a part of a file. These have been fundamental concepts in SPDX now since the 2.0 version. And relationships between these components has been fundamental as well in SPDX since 2.0. So we've been adding lots and lots of relationships based on use cases that people have come to us and said, how do I model this? How do I represent this? So the goal for SPDX is to create these data exchange standards so that it's machine readable and human readable, and we can facilitate the software supply chain processes. And as you can sort of see, the work actually even started a little bit before 2010. It started in 2009. Meeting at some conferences with some people that were interested in the topics, and discussions started. And we sort of worked, it was initially called Package Facts for those who have been around that long. And we became part of the Open Compliance Program at the Linux Foundation and have gone through various releases since then, and as with culminating last year with the ISO's publication. And part of the reason we've been able to do that is there's an underlying model that supports SPDX. Some of the brilliance of people like Gary O'Neill and Alexios and others has been doing the modeling for the 2.0 release. And so that this lets us actually go between the different file formats. We have something called the .spx, which is tag value, but it has the same level of information that's in YAML, you can do it in JSON, XML, RDF, and spreadsheets. You can think of SPDX as a language of concepts you want to exchange. And then these are the serialization formats you can do it in. So for vulnerabilities, as we all know, it's going to be tracking dependencies and which ones matter. So in order to understand what's vulnerable, you're going to need to know all your dependencies, understand which ones are significant, and be able to correlate them to the packages. Do I know that this version of time is the same as the same version of time that you say it's got a vulnerability against it? Now, the NTIA minimum viable says the concept of contains, and that certainly is a good start, but for those who've been sort of dealing with static dynamic dependencies and things like that for many years, it's not always enough. So to sort of illustrate this a bit, you could have an SPDX document that's created by a person on a certain day and time, and it's describing, hey, go figure, log4j. And where it's been coming from, you can have that information there, potentially its license, and potentially some external references to other index systems. Now, oops. As you sort of move forward, you may want to say, hey, this contains this core.class file. But, oh, hey, it also depends on these other packages in order to have an executable. But for some reasons, you may want to know actually what sources has it come from and which version of sources and source files specifically. And so you want me to, hey, that core.class has been generated from this core Java, which was this package here. And, this is a build dependency, hey, in the Maven plugin. Some of these are things that you are going to want to understand, and these are all things that could be impacting in supply chain. What's building things versus, what things are being dependent on to actually be put in the image. All these are areas where there could be a vector of attack. And so this is sort of where, this would be considered effectively a source SBOM, and this might be considered a build SBOM. And all of these are useful in different cases and different scenarios. So figuring out which segmentations we want to make and standardizing on, how to start referring to these things is one of the challenges I think we're going forward with. And as you can see here, there are a tremendous number of types of dependencies we've been having to wrestle with for various use cases over the years. Things like test dependencies, static link, dynamic link, test tools, examples, metafiles. All of these have been added after a use case has been presented to us where we couldn't figure out how to represent it with what we had already. And so if you have a relationship you need to represent between two components that is not listed here, and you can give us a description of a use case, we can certainly look at trying to help you figure out how to use this, or else look at adding another relationship in so that we can model this stuff effectively. And so an example where this is actually being used is in the Zephyr project, where effectively 3 or 4, depending on if there's an SDK involved, SBOMs are created. These first 3, these ones top here, are all source SBOMs. And then this is a built SBOM, which actually links back into these source SBOMs. So you can see the exact .os that made it into your libraries and your .as that eventually get linked into your final thing. And so this is a project that's, Zephyr is for an RTOS. It's a very small footprint RTOS that is, and now has in its build infrastructure, you just basically say, West S, which is the build system, SPDX, and it will start to generate these things automatically. And that's the level we need to get to, where it's just an option and things pop out automatically. I think if we can get there, then we can really see the automation. So the challenge, obviously, though, is correlating these packages to vulnerabilities in databases. And we've recognized that we need to, in SPDX, link into different sorts of, how should we say it, ecosystems or federations of knowledge. And so this is why, we are using we can recognize to the common platform enumerations, which is used with the MBD. We can do pearls. We're probably going to be extending this in the 2.3 to add in some other types that are emerging that people want to correlate into. And software heritage IDs are another type of ID that we're be able to link to, so that you have a way of connecting these pieces through the ecosystem. And one of the things that is just being done recently by Gary, and he was talking about it at FOSDEM I guess about a week and a half ago now, was connecting SPDX into the open source vulnerability database. That's the services provided by Google, and just showing literally how you can use an SBOM and do a little bit of additional scanning work and correlate it to the vulnerabilities that are there. And there's a lot of information out there that's less than precise. That's our reality. We're going to be living with it. But you can get pretty close to these things, and using the data that's there is helpful. So anyone who's interested, he's made the source for it available. It's under his repository SPDX to OSV. and feel free to go look at it. And if there's enough people that want to collaborate on refining it further, I think, we're interested in taking it into the SPDX project. But, feel free to reach out to Gary and have a look at that if this is the sort of thing you're interested in. And there's, other compliance tooling that's useful that are interacting. These are the projects that are sort of collaborating together to work on exchanging SPDX efficiently. They are hosting doc fests where people who are using these, working with SPDX docs who are producing them can get together with those who are consuming them and do some analysis and see, okay, my tool's producing this, how does it compare with your tool in terms of, okay, how are we handling the features? And from that analysis, we usually end up with a bunch of topics to discuss. And from those topics, we're just figuring out, does the spec need to improve, or does the tool need to be fixed? And so some of the changes from these doc fests, you'll see a little bit, they're going to just triggered a 2.3 release for us. And then there's also the OpenChain tooling working group that's busy looking at how do they exchange tooling, and how do we come up with workflows that are effective and efficient for exchanging this type of metadata information. And so I'm sure there's others here on this call that can say a lot more about that work, but these tools are emerging and help is always welcome. So we try to list the tools that we get told about on our page on the SPDX site. We're trying to get some things moved into landscapes, and hopefully you'll see that in this year emerging. But we have online tools, and we are following the NTIA's tool classification of how we follow this taxonomy. And you can go to our site, click on the link to get more details. And we're recording community tools, open source tools, as well as commercial tools, because we need everyone exchanging and interfacing efficiently in order for us to start to solve this problem at scale. Now, it's not just tools. Some of the upstream projects are also now adopting it. I've referred to the SPDX in West with Zephyr already, but Yocto. The Yocto project, with the last release, Hansha, is able to generate software bill of materials for all the build artifacts and make them available. And there's a presentation demo there. And then the Kubernetes bomb tool from the Kubernetes build is able to generate out SBOMs. And there was some videos and demos, so if you're curious, you can follow up more on that. So going back to that survey, the question was, what level of SBOM generation frequency are you going to need? And, people are really wanting it to be, every update, every change, you should have an SBOM, possibly even, and everything that's going into an archive should be SBOM'd. That's kind of how I'm reading this for the early adopters as well as the procrastinators. But, the innovators are wanting it to be, every time anything changes, there's an SBOM. And we need to get things to work at scale for that to happen. And so one example, again, where we're seeing this happen is Renode's an open source project, and it's a simulator for devices. And they've put together a dashboard of Zephyr boards. So these are boards that you can run RTOSes on. And they've got 4 applications, including TensorFlow, Lite, working on the Dining Philosophers and a shell. And if you go into this dashboard, any one of those images, you get a tarball if it's built, and you download it, and it's got 3 SBOMs in it, 2 source and 1 executable. And that SBOM links through these external references to the other sources. This is a built one, by the way. And then it basically has all the intermediate dependencies. Now, when we had Amnesia 33 happen last year in Zephyr, we were using FNet in our LTS, not in our current, but in our LTS. And we didn't have a good way of signaling or analyzing whether or not the key files were there. So being able to go and analyze down to the file level and trace back to the file level whether you're infected or not, and whether you've built that into your image or not, is kind of what we're going to be needing for IoT and in the deep embedded space anyhow. So this type of thing has me excited because literally every one of the ones in here now, and they update it daily based on the Zephyr repos. So it's not like a once and gone. It's automatically updating and it's always having an SBOM generated. And hopefully we'll get there wider in the industry too. So SPDX 2.3, before I sort of use up all my time, we've decided as of last week, we're going to go for it and put one out before we come out with a 3.0, mostly because of the DocFest we had. We had a DocFest the last week of January, and there'd been one prior, but the one in January, from the field tests we were seeing of people using and creating these documents from the various tools, we were seeing a couple of issues that were coming up, and so the aspect being different people were doing different things, and we needed to figure out how to improve it. We've also had people ask for things over the last couple of years, and the things that are lining up with our 3.0 plans will probably be picking up. Things that aren't lining up with the 3.0 plans will probably, or having to need more delay in discussion, will probably work with the 3.0 timeframe or farther, depending on the feature. So what's being considered for 2.3? The package purpose. People want to be able to know whether a package is a container or is it a built image, or what is it for the information that goes associated with it. We've had some discussions with Cyclone DX folks. Gary, I think, and Patrick have been working on this, and we're trying to make sure that we can help round trip between these formats a little bit better, and this seemed to be one of the things that would help. The other thing is adding additional ways of linking to vulnerability status information. Some of the guidance from the NTIA folk have been to have your vulnerability information, because it has a different time scale, separated from your SBOM. So being able to link out to a document that contains the status associated with the vulnerabilities is something that the defects team is working on right now. The SPDX Lite profile was a big part of the 2.2 work that came out, and it's pretty close to the minimum fields, except it's missing the supplier as a mandatory field. So we'll probably just turn that, make it a mandatory, we'll extend that profile to say that another field is mandatory. And then, like I say, selected ones from the backlog. We want to get this one turned quickly this next quarter. And then see if we can get the toolings start to be deployed using this new version a little bit later then. And then obviously, the 3.0 work had started, and part of the reason it's been so an interesting while is there's been a lot of different forms of people working on the project problem, and we've come together with the CISC 3T SBOM team. We merged the groups to work on Define 3.0. And so SPDX went through a major exercise of updating its governance model so that we could actually make this all work together for everyone. And 3.0 has been in ongoing discussions. The way to think about 3.0 is it's got the same thing as 2.0, but it's adding additional information from some of the use cases that CISC wants to cover. So 3.0 will have the same ability to represent what we've got today in 2.2, but we'll be adding in more use cases in. And so, why is it taking so long, and why are we changing our underlying model? We want to be able to go more from just software to scale up to systems. And people are wanting to capture things like, training data in the AI space, how we can, catch the information about the hardware configs that systems or software is running on for medical devices and for safety analysis, as well as some of the services that someone may be deploying. All these are things that we want to be able to do for a wider set of use cases than we're handling today, because that's what's running out there. And keeping data lakes of this information coherent and being able to augment it with various attestations, that is, going to be key for doing proper risk analysis. And, linking these SBOMs with other types of attestations is one of the directions. We've already started doing that with our external references and have been for, 5 years or so. But there's some other emerging places we're going to want to link to, and so that people can, walk and crawl it through and do the appropriate risk analysis. Timescale wise, hoping to finish this core model off, and then get the additional profiles and check some serializations this year. and start to see the libraries and tooling emerge in Q4. That's roughly what we're hoping for. The more we can work on, we're obviously trying to pull that in, but some of these discussions take a lot of time. When you have a lot of people in the room and a lot of different use cases, working together is what's going to give us a sounder foundation for a long term. So if people want to help, help is very much welcome. One of the things that you can do to help the project is if your organization's using, SPDX as an SBOM format, please consider joining. There's no fee for if you're an LF member already, and you can get your logo highlighted on the page. It's on the spdx.dev website, and I showed you the thing earlier in the screen. If you know of a tool or project that's able to work, we've got a landscape we're trying to populate out. And so please put in a pull request if you want to be listed there. And then if you've got some use cases that you want to make sure get supported in SPDX3 or further releases, and you don't quite know how to reflect them, join on the mailing lists and ask the questions, or put an issue in our spec repo and join in on the discussion. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for your interest, and feel free to come join us and learn more.
Hey, thank you. To get the questions started, if I may, can I ask you two really difficult ones? Yes, of course I can. The first one is, why is 3.0 coming quite quickly? And that's just from the optics of the OpenChain project, where, in 2020, we were like, we'll come back to this in 2023 to 2025.
I think the optics of it are, it's feeling really slow to us, actually. We're using things and trying to discuss this. But what we're trying to do is get it so that some of the extent, like when we went from 1.0 to 2.0, we did a major abstraction into the SPDX. We went from just having, packages, a collection of packages, to actually having groupings of groupings and meta. And what we're trying to do is effectively expand out the meta again yet further, so that we can actually get to be able to represent those additional use cases. And there is need in the market to do that. We have, especially like in things that have to go after safety certifications. Okay. If I'm starting to see AI being used, I want to be able to have an accurate record of my training data and have the necessary information associated so that I have some degree of confidence in the reproducibility that's going on. So there's pressure to do it, and we want to make as many use cases handled. And people have massive databases of all the components and all the software, potentially to the file level, that they want to be tracking. And we need to make it easy for them to work with this information and also to link back to sources of truth so that we can have the full chain of integrity here.
That makes a lot of sense. My second question relates to multiple software bill of materials out there. So there was SWID, which is an older ISO standard, and I believe we could say it's more narrowly scoped than SPDX. So it's sort of natural to see a newer, broader standard switch from de facto to formal standard. But there's also other software bill of material options out there. And kind of touching on Brian's point earlier, there's some things where it makes sense to have less options rather than more. Why do we have quite a few software bill of materials out there? And do you have any idea of the relative popularity of them?
That's hard to say. I'm afraid, because there's different fidelity of information that gets stored between them. The tooling that's out there is at various levels of maturity. So I think most vendors right now are sort of supporting both SPDX and CycloneDX and sort of hedging their bets in both directions is kind of my view on it. Cyclone is much simpler to implement as a quick thing. On the other hand, the rigor that's gone into pulling together the SPDX stuff over time, all the use cases and all the discussion that's gone on, lets you, go go into high res effectively. If you want, is probably the way to sort of think about it. They've got different viewpoints on, the use cases they support. So I don't really want to get into, it's not fair without one of them sitting on the call for going into the strengths and weaknesses here, okay? But I think, getting the basic information there, I think for the SPDX side, a lot of the innovators have adopted SPDX. That's what we've seen from the survey. And they're able to, move beyond the basic cases too.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kate. If there's any more questions, you can throw them into the chat or just raise your hand. And if there's no other questions right now, I just want to say thank you, Kate. We've all been following SPDX for a long time. Our community, in fact, was responsible for writing SPDX Lite, one of the additions to 2.2.1 and the ISO standard. So obviously it's front of mind, but it's very good to have that overview.
Sorry, Shane. I'll also say thank you very much to the OpenChain community as well, because they're working very hard right now on getting the usage profile defined.
Yeah.
And so big shout out to them. I think we're getting close to having some of the first fields and being able to get the pull requests going to start talk about usage and what makes sense to track as part of that. So put that in 3.0.
Thank you, Kate. And now, as we begin to move to the next speaker, I just want to say that OpenChain always works like a Japanese address. We sort of tell you the planet, we tell you the country, we then tell you the prefecture, eventually the city, and so on. We zoom in. So today we're doing the same. We started with the big picture of security with OpenSSF. We moved to SPDX and Kate's lovely presentation. And now we're zooming in further to how the industry actually responded to one of the specific issues out there. I have kidnapped Matt from FOSSA to talk about what he saw in the domain space of actual market response to Log4j. And this is us zooming in to the practical market conditions, what happened and how it was mitigated. Matt, I'll throw the floor over to you.
All right, thank you, Shane. Just to start, am I clear?
Yeah, it's good. Your video is a tiny bit grainy, but it's cool.
All right, great. I will share my screen. Give me a moment.
For everyone who's currently stuck in a boring or cold place, Matt's in Barbados. So you can raise your jealousy levels appropriately.
Yeah, you live and learn. My name is Matt Schwartz. I'm a senior software engineer for FOSSA. In case you're unfamiliar with FOSSA, the company name stands for Free Open Source Software Analytics, and that's what we do. We analyze your open source software and make sure you're compliant with all licensure, and we notify you and warn you if you bring in known vulnerabilities, CVs. So the frame for this presentation is just talking about Log4Shell and responding on the front lines. At least that's how it felt like for me. There's a slight agenda here, and we're going to start just kind of playing dumb here, going over a high-level overview of what is Log4Shell, what made it bad, some basic methodology for mitigation of vulnerabilities in open source software, and then I'm referring to the time on the front lines as the fog of war, just because things were pretty unknown and very fluid at the time of publication and exploits. Then we're going to end on the customer impact and the response, and then steps you can take to prepare for the next 0 day as it becomes published. So starting off, let's explain Log4Shell. And to start, we have to talk about Log4j, which is just a logging package that's very ubiquitous within the Java ecosystem. And it's ubiquitous to the point where you'll find it at large enterprises like banks and cloud software providers, down to like game companies like Minecraft. It's everywhere. So Log4Shell specifically, as was mentioned earlier, was a vulnerability in how the log messages that were processed by Log4j were interpolated for certain values, special values, specifically JNDI lookups using an LDAP protocol would say, hey, look at the server, download this class and run it. but just in the form of a string. And this allowed arbitrary code to run on the server that was impacted. So an example of this exploit here is just a hard-coded log in a example exploit that I'd run a couple months ago. And here we're just making a request to some ngrok server I set up and download a malicious class. What is particularly bad about this is just that we log a lot of information that we don't control as engineers. So every user agents, usernames, things like that. So it's very easy for someone to exploit this, knowing that most of these fields are already logged. And that's part of what made it so bad. So next up, I want to talk about more broadly how vulnerabilities are generally resolved, and then we'll start to get into the meat of what I think most of us here are trying to listen for. And the answer is upgrade to a safe version. Thank you everyone for coming to my talk. It's been a pleasure, and it's really never that easy. So we have to touch on the difference between direct and transitive dependencies. So earlier, I believe a dependency graph was mentioned, and that was in the context of just dependencies within the software development pipeline. In this case, when I say dependency graph, I'm talking about your open source software dependencies for a particular source code that you are writing. A dependency graph in this context is generally expressed in the form of a tree, where the root of that tree is the project that you are authoring. And then that project can bring in arbitrary open source dependencies. We call these your direct dependencies, D1 through D3. Each of these dependencies can also bring in their own open source dependencies, and so on and so forth. It's turtles all the way down. We refer to these as the transitive dependencies. What's worth emphasizing here is that your direct dependencies are the only dependencies with which you can directly specify. Everything else is brought in as a byproduct of your direct dependencies. So these are the easiest levers to change in order to fix a vulnerability. So for example, if in D1, you had a vulnerability that needed to be resolved and a patch was already published, you update it and you're done. However, if your vulnerability is in T4, a transitive dependency, the only lever you have directly available in order to try and fix this is to modify D2. And hope that upgrading D2 will upgrade D1 and upgrade, T1 and upgrade T4. The semantics of this will vary based on language, tools, and ecosystem, but the general concept applies broadly. So there are different strategies that you can take to mitigate your transitive dependency, transitive vulnerabilities. So the first question is the easiest approach. Can updating the direct dependency result in safely updating the transitive dependency? This is going to be very context dependent. Sometimes you don't even need to update the direct dependency. You can just update your graph and pull down the latest version. Again, it's domain specific. Next up, you have to ask, are you actually exposed to the vulnerability? Let's say you can't directly fix it. Now, I would not recommend starting here, but this means going down through each dependency in the dependency import chain and figuring out how the vulnerable dependency is being used, and if that manner of usage exposes you to whatever vulnerability is in question. Another approach is updating a transitive dependency directly. So if you have pinned versions or say a locked file, you might be able to go in and directly change the version. Now you have to be careful here because even if you're working in a compiled language, this doesn't always guarantee that the code will work. I have personal experience here where I was working with an interface that that went from a required parameter to an optional parameter. All the code compiled fine, but at runtime, the virtual function lookup failed and it broke. So even though we directly had this and the code compiled fine, we assumed great, our tests are passing, we're good. It was not good enough. The last two options are a bit more sidestepping the vulnerability, and that is, can you just remove the direct dependency that brings in the transitive vulnerability? So if you don't need the direct dependency, or you can in-house a solution, or you can find an alternative, this may be a viable solution to just remove the vulnerable package from your dependency graph completely. And lastly, as a not necessarily independent operation, you can try to offset your risk without changing a version. So for instance, there might not be a patch deployed yet, but there may be some mitigation efforts, and they might not be comprehensive. They may just lower your risk of being exposed to an attack. And we can talk more about this later, specifically as it concerns Log4j and Log4Shell. And this brings us to that later part, which is, again, referring this to the fog of war, just because it really was a ambiguous time to be on the front lines. So this story starts on December 6th of 2021, when a patch to Log4Shell was published, and this was prior to the vulnerability being disclosed. And that patch was for version 2.15. Come December 9th, the vulnerability was published, courtesy of Alibaba's cloud security team. However, no CVE had yet been assigned. Now, our infrastructure at FASA normally assumes that between publication of a vulnerability and a CVE being assigned is not a large enough gap to generally be concerned. However, as we are very well aware of today, Log4Shell was a very different case. We were very lucky and fortunate to have two of our engineers be former MITRE employees, as well as two of our engineers being involved with our Minecraft development community, which, so Minecraft might seem like it's coming out of left field here if you're unaware of the history of Log4Shell. The initial, on December 9th, prior to the CVE being assigned, but after the vulnerability had been published, some malicious actors realized that they could send chat messages to the chat logs in Minecraft, which would then get picked up by Log4j and execute an attack, even if they were a non-privileged user. Obviously, Minecraft server operators did not like this, and they didn't want to wait to see what the fallout would be or wait to see how we could patch it. So they just turned their services off, and that's just an ode to how bad this was. But because we had ears to the ground through back channels with MITRE, and also just being aware of what was happening with Minecraft, we were very prepared and acted on this very quickly. So on December 10th at 1 a.m., we manually created an entry in our database for the not yet assigned CVE for Log4Shell. And this was at 1 a.m. on December 10th. Later in that day, a CVE was finally assigned, but this is where the fog of war really started to settle in. It was assigned to both the Log4j API and Log4j core. And the problem here is the API was simply the interface definitions without implementation and posed no risk of exploit. Only Log4j core was impacted. And this caused a lot of confusion between our customers and us internally, because we're basically fighting the other authoritative sources and saying, no, we're right, trust us. So moving on December 14th, it became apparent that the original patch from December 6th wasn't enough. It didn't cover all the edge cases that allowed for an exploit. So lo and behold, 2.16.0 was the next safest version, and that was where the story did not end. There was yet another exploit. The patch introduced in 2.16 introduced two additional vulnerabilities, another harder but still remote code execution exploit, and then a denial of service exploit. And we were able to finally call this, case closed on December 18th with the publication of version 2.17.1, where I would recommend upgrading to if you have not yet resolved your Log4Shell issues. You should, for anyone watching this in the future, please refer to up-to-date documentation, because as we see, this might not be the case. So just on a personal note, as an engineer working on these front lines, if you're a security researcher watching this, just take December off. Don't publish on Thursdays or Fridays. It honestly ruins the holiday season. All joking aside, this was a lot of work from every end and required a lot of internal and external coordination, as well as I know a deluge of different engineers across all companies in different industries working night and day trying to make sure that they were safe from Log4Shell. And in case you can't tell, this was a joke. I am not serious. If you're a security researcher, continue doing God's work. So next up, I want to focus on what it was like fighting on the front lines from FOSSA HQ. And before we get into the details here, a little bit of background is helpful. So we have 3 different flavors of customers. Our SaaS cloud customers, where if you go to the website, you sign up for an account, works just as normal. Then we have our hybrid and on-premise customers. So each of these customers get a copy of our infrastructure. The difference is the hybrid customers have a copy of our infrastructure hosted in our cloud, but it's walled off from every other customer. So a dedicated database, logging, Kubernetes cluster, et cetera. And on-premise customers, it's the same thing, but it's running on their servers. And then by pure serendipity, in November 2021, we had updated the mechanism by which we use to update the vulnerability data for on-premise and hybrid customers to provide that data in near real time. And this very much saved our butts when it came to Log4Shell. The last relevant bit of information is that we have a CLI tool referred to as FOSSA CLI that is generally used inside a company's CI infrastructure to build a dependency graph, send that over to our servers, and then we can provide the services for determining if you are compliant with company policy for licensure, or if you've introduced a vulnerability that violates some policy, or just to be aware of. So in the time, at the time of, because this was happening over, what was it, 9 days, we had to build a coordinated effort that was non-trivial, especially considering part of the team was out due to COVID and part of the team was out because of holidays. And it's a very bad precedent to call people in if they're on holiday. At least that's my personal opinion. So we made an explicit effort to try and keep things with the team we had. So we coordinated efforts across 3 fronts, and that was marketing and communication, engineering, and customer service. So I'm going to start to speak about marketing and communication, because no solution that we came up with would be good if we didn't adequately communicate to our customers, prospective customers, and invested individuals that just want information on what's happening. So this meant that we needed to report information as quickly as possible to our blog and other services, and make sure it was as up-to-date as possible. So that meant keeping up to date with Twitter feeds with the relevant people, and making sure that things like the Log4j API being vulnerable really was incorrect, and communicating that effectively. Additionally, we had similar concerns with engineering, but through a slightly different lens. So our biggest concern was with accurate data and dissemination. As I mentioned before, our infrastructure wasn't set up didn't expect a case where the time between identification and updating of that data, where 5 minutes would really matter to our customers. We set up a lot of caching in our infrastructure because some of these operations are quite expensive. And so those caches hurt our accurate data. So we actively needed to work on our SaaS product, but also coordinate with all of our on-premise and hybrid customers to make sure that their configurations were modified so that the caches would not step in the way of new data. On top of that, we needed to make sure that there was custom tooling available for those that were not already our customers. And this isn't really like a marketing ploy. I personally pushed for this because I wanted to work with, and did work with, the Barbados government on making sure they were safe from Log4Shell. And I wanted an easy way with a simple command using our existing CLI without any backend, without any server, without any account, to just say, hey, this is the version you're using. If you have it at all, this is vulnerable, and then link to or provide the relevant copy for how to make updates. And then lastly, customer service. Now, this seems kind of obvious, but it's important to note that when dealing with this level of technical issue in real time, it can be hard for our customer service agents to have all the relevant information. And the goal was to shield engineering from needing to respond to everything when we needed to have heads down dealing with more broad issues. So building a playbook for our customer service team in real time to be able to answer frequent questions and other similar concerns, just to allow engineers that were really driving this effort to be freed up and focus on the most critical aspects. And overall, this coordination had a few hiccups, but we delivered quite well. Our blog was one of the top results coming on Google and still is, as well as data about how our customers were impacted reflects just this. So this moves us to the scope of customer impact. So as a little bit of a background here, the data I'm presenting here doesn't include our generally largest customers, which is going to be our on-premise and hybrid customers. Most of them were using Java and had some level of impact. So these numbers are definitely going to skew low. But of our cloud customers, 70% of them that use Java were impacted. And of the projects that they had in our system, 35% of them were directly exposed to Log4Shell. Of the ones that were exposed and had active accounts, because we still have a couple people upload things and never check. Of the accounts that were clearly active, where users had logged in within the last couple of months, engaged, nearly 100% of the issues that were raised due to Log4Shell were addressed via some form of upgrade. What was curious, though, is that there were 4 issues that were manually ignored by customers with notes to some effect of, not impacted, move on. I can't speak to the veracity of these, but you're talking about less than 1% of the issues that have popped up being manually resolved, and 1% is being generous for issues. So I think the most important part to focus on when talking about our customers is what did they care about? In real time, when this was happening, the biggest ask was, can FOSSA reliably generate SBOMs to capture all the projects that were using any version of Log4j? Because it became very clear early on that the scope of what was actually impacted was going to be up in the air. Our customers wanted to make sure that they would be able to query this SBOM very quickly to say, oh, Log4j 16 actually isn't safe. All right, what's still impacted by this? And this also became relevant for companies that wanted to track which projects that weren't in FOSSA, just because an SBOM was a really good way to have a summary of those missing projects. Next up for the concerns was just data quality. There was a period of time due to the caches on our on-prem and hybrid deployments that data was in the database correct, but the caches were showing bad information. So that was another clear issue. And if you are working with a vendor like FOSSA in the future, don't be afraid to reach out in these situations. We're actively trying to work with you and resolve these issues. On a similar note, a question of scale came into play. Our customers were very, very well aware that everyone else that was infected by this wanted to have analysis run. Unfortunately, running these scans is fairly expensive within our infrastructure. So a big concern was, hey, I know you can work with our stuff at once, but what about everyone's? So at the same time, we were also working to scale up our infrastructure to make sure that we were ready for the spike in requests, as well as working with our on-premise customers to make sure that their infrastructure was appropriately scaled, because they generally didn't have a spike of everything being scanned at the same time. On the flip side, some of the processing here was done with queues, which meant that the scale could work, but it would just be slow. So it wasn't just scale, will we fall over? It was scale and performant under really stressful spikes. Another rather interesting event that our customers cared about was responsibility chains within their own organization. So as mentioned before, the FOSSA CLI integrates into CI, and you can test against your existing policies inside of FOSSA to break a build if some new CVE or license violates an internal policy. Not all companies will break on all CVEs, and as a result, they use FOSSA more as an information dashboard about known vulnerabilities. The problem is that people looking at the FOSSA app were not the same people that would have been fixing the actual bugs, or sorry, fixing the actual Log4Shell issue on these projects. So the engineers didn't see any broken builds, so they're like, we're fine, move on. So the issue that came as a result were the people that were on our application had no idea who to contact or how to contact them. Needless to say, this wasn't something directly that we at FOSSA could resolve, but we still would help our customers work internally to get summaries of projects and via commit information, the relevant commit information, just to make sure that they knew who to contact. This was a very, very interesting edge case that I personally was not expecting. Other such concerns were untracked projects. Not all projects were in FOSSA. They either deleted it or they didn't upload. So this goes back to the SBOM earlier, just being able to determine what an organization concretely knew they had knowledge about and where they had knowledge gaps and how they could fill those gaps. As mentioned earlier, the conversation about direct versus transitive dependencies. Well, how do you mitigate an issue with a transitive dependency here? It might not be straightforward, especially with Java. There's no default lock file implementation. There's no guarantee that pin versions would be available and you could easily tweak things. So part of this was communicating to customers like, hey, start with non-upgrade mitigation efforts, like turning off some default values, removing the LDAP class from the binary entirely, which keeps it 100% secure, or setting up a WAF to try and detect potentially malicious requests, sending some type of JNDI request over the network. And on a similar note, that is the non-upgrade mitigation steps. And just lastly, there was another concern of third-party vendors that were also impacted. So think like Elasticsearch, where uncontrolled customer input can still get sent in the form of logs. So if you're using a hosted Elasticsearch version or hosted Elasticsearch instance, you may still be exposed to Log4Shell simply because under the hood they use Apache Lucene, which uses Log4j. With Elasticsearch specifically, I'm not trying to throw them under the bus. It's just an easy example for me to reference. They actually were barely exposed. Most of the modern versions were fine. Additionally, the NCSC NL repo for Log4Shell was made to track third-party software vendors to see if they had even started investigation to see if they were exposed, what the results of that investigation are, and mitigation steps if they were impacted. So it's not just your source code that matters, it's where data or client control data would be piped to, and these third-party services that were also at risk. So the last part of the presentation today is I want to talk about both how to prepare and how to respond in real time to the next 0 day. So this isn't going to be comprehensive, but these are just the high-level points that I think might not be as readily apparent to those that have experience in the industry. So to start, look for useful tooling. Tools like the FOSSA CLI log4j command were immensely useful, and they required no sign-up. Additionally, there were other tools that would automatically, there's one I found that would execute an attack using log4j to patch log4j on servers. It's very creative, but there's tons of different creative solutions for identification and mitigation that come as a result of these very critical 0-day vulnerabilities after they get published. You should also always be ready for changes in previously correct information. So just like the log4j API misattribution to being vulnerable, you should be ready, you should prepare yourself for conditions where previous information was wrong. So as a reference, our customers that ask for SBOMs of all projects that could potentially have log4j is a call out to this particular event here. They understood that as the information changed, they wanted a quick way to validate, and it would be quicker than waiting for our infrastructure to pick up the new vulnerabilities and running a rescan. And then lastly, be ready to work with your software vendors. Third-party services, as I mentioned before, can be impacted. You should keep a record of all the third-party services that are receiving some form of your data, whether it be logs or any form of your data, and push them when these 0 days come out. It's not really top of mind to think that these third parties could potentially be another vector of attack for you, but you might potentially be exposed through them. It's perfectly appropriate to push them on this. Do not hesitate. And then also check for repos like the NCSC repo for aggregation of this information. And then lastly, how to actually prepare for the next 0 day. There are steps that you can take proactively. So understand your org's dependency graph. If you don't have this higher level knowledge beforehand, you're in a world of hurt. If you have to manually check your dependency graphs, you're going to have a bad time. Using open source management tools like FOSSA is going to be the key to getting quick operational knowledge that is critical to making the right decisions early on and quickly. You should also have a plan for how to deal with transitive vulnerabilities. Practices such as pinned versions with lock files greatly improve your ability to modify a transitive dependency in order, because you can go in, maybe change a particular version and test that all of your software works as expected. You should also have a plan in place for how you expect to go to validate the correct behavior for when you make these changes within your transitive dependency graph. What I would also recommend here is have a fire drill. Pretend that some transitive dependency that you're using is vulnerable. Tell your team this is vulnerable, you need to fix it now, and see what path they go through or just how easy or hard it is. Until this happens, you won't really know just how impacted you are or how difficult this will be. And then lastly, understand the chain of responsibility. When you are using tools like FOSSA to monitor the state of your open source usage within your company, you should be able to tell who is responsible for each project internally. If it's 2 a.m. and the lawyer is checking out some license compliance and they see something bad and they need to contact someone, they should be able to easily tell who that is, either within FOSSA or within whatever service you use or internal to that company. And I just want to emphasize, these aren't a comprehensive list of preparation or tools and services you can use, but these are the most interesting takeaways that I was able to gain from having worked with many different companies in real time that I was really surprised with. And that concludes the summary of what happens on the 9-ish days of Log4Shell. We're just hell. And just as a quick note, visit fossa.com for more information. And if you have any questions, if you're watching this in the future, first of all, hello. And also just send me messages at, or rather emails at matt@fossa.com, and I'll be more than happy to answer. So I would like to open up the floor to questions, anyone that has them.
Now, if there's no immediate questions, we will say, hey, thanks, Matt. That was awesome. We're going to do the pulling out a bit to the big picture now again. So I'm going to grab the screen and show you some stuff. Alrighty. Basically, the OpenChain project has been quite busy in the security domain. And we've been talking about it for a while. You can see one of our explicit positional posts on the website here. And to assist you with your review of this and all the other stuff I'm talking about, check out the chat. I'm just posting some information into it that will help you get all of the links I'm discussing. So we've got a position on security, and essentially our position is that our community is doing security. We have a great deal of interest in getting it right. And in particular, we want to serve as an excellent junction to onboard people into the specifics of what they need to do and what they need to accomplish. We have explicitly been calling out security and security process management approaches since August of last year, when we released our security assurance reference guide. This was based on market pull. We had companies asking us how to address security. and we had companies actively using the OpenChain standard for security. Now, OpenChain ISO 5230 is a license compliance standard, but it's very high level, and it's about the inflection points needed in processes to allow a quality conformance program. As it happens, those inflection points overlap with the security domain to a very great degree. If you're identifying the software on inbound, internal, and outbound, if you've got a policy of how to address that software, these are all things you do in security too. So our security reference guide basically said, oh, you're doing security, here's how the OpenChain spec can help you. And our goal was to ensure people would have a common approach and common understanding of how this process standard can help them in that domain. This discussion, of course, has evolved as they do. And our document, which essentially as a reference guide was a remix of the OpenChain standard, cutting it down to the points you needed, is now expanding out a bit in the opposite direction. It's beginning to more explicitly address security, and it's changing from a guide into a reference specification, a reference standard. It is not ready for prime time yet, but it is out there, it is being drafted, and it is going somewhere. Here's an example of the document itself. It's also direct linked in the chat. You can see that I've highlighted in 3.1.5 standard practice implementation, and in particular highlighted in red, things like having a method for continuous and repeated security testing. This draft spec is intended to help you have the mental modeling for security in the same manner as we had the mental modeling for license compliance. To my knowledge, this is the only spec at this point in time dealing with a very high level process management approach to open source and security. We naturally, as I said, want to be a junction to onboard people into specific activities. So stuff like Salsa is going to be very much part of this dialogue moving forward. And you are most wholeheartedly invited to be part of all of this. The OpenChain project does everything in the open, everything on our calls and our mailing lists. You can check the link I just put into the chat. You'll find our community super active around the world. We have a ridiculous number of calls, webinars, and local groups. And that's why we're very confident that what we're doing is very useful, or at least substantially useful, or failing that, vaguely useful. Now, when it comes to how we're trying to bring our community closer to solving various problems like security, export control, merger and acquisitions, the Security Assurance Reference Guide is a good example of the starting point. We're trying to also bring together our community and other communities with events like this, the Security Summit. We have an Intellectual Property Summit coming in March, and a few months after that, we'll have an Automation Summit looking at all the tooling options out there, particularly open source tooling for open source compliance. Your big takeaway from today should be that the Linux Foundation is doing a lot in the security domain. It should be that there is a specific foundation, Open Source Security Foundation, focused on this domain and solving some really cool problems in the space. We have an ISO standard for software bill of materials, which is really useful, and it's got a lot of momentum. So approaching OpenSSF, approaching SPDX takes you a long way towards being able to fill out multiple levels of security challenges in your company. You should also take away that the OpenChain project, which of course was founded to build an ISO standard for license compliance and has accomplished that goal, we also run other activities and other discussions. We're explicitly working on security. We have released a guide on security, and that guide is being expanded into a reference specification live and right here, right now. You can be part of that. What will probably happen in the end is we'll have guides for export control and merger and acquisitions as well. And at some point, we'll be deciding if those guides evolving into reference specs will be future modules of the OpenChain ISO standard or become sister specifications of the standard or take another role in the community. And naturally, we'll be working with people like Brian at Open Source Security Foundation as we do this. So that's the big picture. Again, we pulled out from down in the weeds, going to the big picture, and we're nearly ready to wrap it up, but I do want to throw open the floor to some questions before we do. The first question that I saw, Jeff just raised one, and this is, I think, for Matt. Jeff said, in the spirit of the Open Source Security Foundation, is FOSSA able to find and alert the community to commonly used large open source projects that aren't fixing their log4j or similar issues?
So this is, this might be a little hard to answer, just because we are only aware of the projects that are imported to our backend. And then similarly, our customers probably wouldn't be too happy with us saying like, hey, by the way, customer ABC is being irresponsible with their security. So even if that's the case, I would see it pretty hard to make it public. I'd say internally, we definitely want to apply pressure because we don't want our customers to be impacted. But more broadly, I think with the Log4j specifically, the upgrades should be relatively safe to 2.17.1. So you can just manually update your, if you're using a project that pulls in a vulnerable version of Log4j, you can either just remove the LDAP class entirely or just pin the version to the safe version.
Thank you, Matt. That's an excellent answer, both diplomatic and helpful. Now, does anyone else have an additional question before we begin to wrap up our summit? All right, this event is recorded. It will be going out to our broader community. We had a really nice audience. We had over 50 at our peak. Very happy with that. We are really happy with the fact that we are able to work with projects inside Linux Foundation. We're able to work with companies around the ecosystem. Join us with our biweekly global calls, our biweekly webinars, and lots of regional work groups that operate in the local languages. For those of you who don't know it, OpenChain has probably the largest reference material repository in the world for things related not only to compliance, but overarching company approaches to process governance. And you'll find that on GitHub, direct link in the chat. Appreciating, again, your attention and your contributions. We are a community which tries to be as open as possible. The thing we found out in the last 7 years is that the more people we work with, the more open our community, the more great solutions we get. And OpenChain is at the forefront of that, thanks to you.